Stop analyzing other people, a Zen sleep story. Right now, there is a heavy, localized dullness resting right on top of the crown of your head. It feels like an unyielding leaden cap, pressing down through your skull bones, tightening the delicate muscles behind your ears, and drawing a tense, defensive line across your eyebrows. This is the distinct physical anchor of intellectual hypervigilance, the deep, somatic exhaustion that builds when you spend every daylight hour obsessively weighing, parsing, and calculating the subtle movements, casual words, and hidden intentions of everyone around you. You are carrying the weight of an internal balance scale that never stops tilting, exhausting your spirit by trying to decode facial expressions, text message tones, and brief silences to protect yourself from the sudden sting of disapproval or rejection. The mind is working at a furious velocity even now, replaying the day's encounters, trying to figure out if an offhand comment meant you are losing ground, treating your social safety as a complex mathematical equation that must be solved before you are allowed to rest. The quiet shelter of your room is adjusting to the early winter evening, offering a dry, alpine sanctuary where the ceaseless momentum of your self-protection can be allowed to coast to a complete halt. Outside, a sharp wind is whistling through the slatted cedar walls of the valley structures, while a thin, crisp mountain air seals the high trails in an unhurried stillness that requires no active defense from the pines. Inside, the earthy medicinal aroma of dried mugwort rises softly from a bundle hanging near the ceiling, blending naturally with the bitter, grounded scent of chicory roots stored in a low wooden bin. The faint amber glow of a single grease lamp burning down in a small slate dish casts long, motionless shadows across the rough-sawn cedar wall panels, while the thick, tightly woven mat beneath your hips absorbs the heavy pressure of your upper frame. The unrefined, cool texture of the linen sheet beneath your neck begins to draw the residual, nervous heat away from your skin, gently inviting the tight muscles at the base of your skull to drop their analytical brace. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the full weight of your head sink back into the stable center of the bedding, allowing the complex definitions of your social standing to remain completely unclassified in the dark. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are tracking in this heavy, localized dullness resting on the crown of your head is not a personal failure, nor is it a sign that you are fundamentally deficient or lacking in true confidence, because your thoughts continue to process the anatomy of other people's opinions. The profound numbness you carry tonight is a wise, natural message, a stark physical indication that your system has simply worn out its scales from trying to comprehend your worth through the shifting metrics of external approval alone. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you immediately locate a state of profound, vibrant indifference before you are allowed to sleep. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to figure out the hidden meaning behind someone else's mood before your eyebrows are allowed to let go of their tightness. Right now, nothing is required of you now, and you are safe enough to soften. There is a profound, liberating paradox within the heart of Buddhist insight that speaks directly to this intellectual burnout through a surprising, unyielding truth. We live under the persistent illusion that our emotional safety is a structural calculation, believing that if we can only understand the exact psychological mechanics of those around us, we will finally achieve the right to exist without being rejected. We treat our relationships as a perpetual weighing laboratory, constantly examining every grain of human interaction under the sharp glass of analysis to outrun the terrifying vulnerability of being unseen. But the ancient wisdom of the Zen tradition reveals that suffering does not arise because you lack a perfect diagnosis of another person's intent. The deepest agony takes root when the mind mistakes its analytical weights for the actual texture of reality. This is the truth of the variable balance. When a delicate hornbeam scale has sat in a damp cellar until the wood grain expands unevenly, the beam tilts stubbornly to one side even when both bronze pans are completely empty. The suffering is not the presence of other people's judgments, but the refusal to see that the instrument you are using to measure your worth has become warped by your own fear. True rest is not the calculation of the self, it is the realization that your value was never resting on the pan. Maybe you have felt this too, the sudden, hollow panic at midnight when you realize that despite reading every psychological explanation and intellectualizing every social interaction, the internal space within your chest still feels completely flat, parched, and thinned. The mind turns inward, transforming this structural hypervigilance into a harsh personal judgment, whispering that because you are constantly scanning for threat, you are fundamentally ungrateful, weak, and broken. This is the mechanism that adds a second wound to the simple fatigue of a long day. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral limitation of a human spirit that has gone numb from using logic to survive a chaotic world. The second pain is the cruel indictment you strike against your own crown, declaring that your exhaustion is a permanent defect that must be corrected through even harder mental scrutiny tomorrow. But the dried mugwort does not apologize to the attic for its bitterness, and the unpolished bronze counterweight does not feel remorse for its weight under the winter air. The dullness you feel across your skull is merely a temporary configuration of form, completely unable to diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is holding your room tonight. In a few moments, our attention will journey toward a cold, dim, herb-drying attic filled with hanging stalks at the edge of the high ridge, where a young apprentice sat staring at an unpolished bronze counterweight with an off-center suspension loop, carrying the exact same heavy cap that is binding your crown right now. But before we step onto that dry wooden floor, allow your awareness to notice the physical weight of your head. Let the deep spaces between your skull bones and your jaw widen. Let the forehead muscles release their defensive bracing, and let the small tendons around your ears give up their tight coordination. You do not need to force anything tonight, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning light arrives. The world will manage its own complex formulas without your constant supervision for the next few hours, and every variable balance, every analyzed glance, and every unnotched beam can remain completely stranded in the dark. We spend so much of our life treating our intellect as a bridge that must be continuously extended over the void, believing that if we allow the analysis to stop for even a single hour, we will fall instantly into social chaos. We evaluate our stability by the accuracy of our diagnoses, and then we wonder why our upper neck feels like cold iron when the daylight fades. But the vast mountain ridge does not feel a shred of guilt for remaining exposed, rugged, and empty beneath the stars, and the frozen grass does not apologize to the sky for freezing its growth. The numbness you hold does not come from the simple fact that you have interactions to process it grows, from the current resistance that refuses to let the bronze pan sit empty, without demanding that your core immediately justify its existence, through more conceptual production. Let another breath arrive naturally, without you needing to measure its depth or prove its alignment. Let it move directly into the tight channels of your crown, down through the back of your neck, and deep into the very center of your shoulder blades. You are nothing more than a living form resting in a quiet room, completely free from the metrics, categories, and analytical structures of the waking world. In the deep silence that is growing between us, the cool mountain air is moving through the slatted wood outside, requiring no final insights and demanding no perfect explanations before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the linen beneath your calves, as we prepare to step onto the dry wooden floor of the herb attic, where the keeper of the scales is waiting to show us how to let the weight slide, deep within the cold, dim herb-drying attic situated at the edge of the high mountain ridge, where the stormy autumn twilight cast pale charcoal shadows across the rafters. The air remained filled with the sharp, clean aroma of hanging mugwort stalks and dried chicory roots. Inside this small timber space, a young apprentice named Shinji moved with a heavy, localized dullness that seemed locked directly into the center of his crown, pulling the skin behind his ears into a tight, perpetual brace. His presence in the mountain pharmacy was driven by an exhausting internal mission. He had been tasked with journeying down to the town market each week to procure rare wilderness minerals and trading agreements, an environment that filled his mind with an intense analytical velocity. He processed his social encounters with a fierce hyper-vigilance, spending his nights replaying every phrase spoken by the merchants, calculating his standing in the eyes of the elders, and parsing the subtle shifts in people's tones to ensure he was not secretly disliked or facing rejection. Every evening, even while resting his frame on a plain cedar floor mat, Shinji's eyebrows remained pulled together, his skull holding the physical leaden cap of a system that could only relate to human connection, as a dangerous matrix of hidden meanings that had to be deciphered. He treated the casual conversations of the day not as spontaneous moments to be shared, but as a perilous ledger of personal judgment, believing that if he could only anticipate the exact psychological motives of those around him, he would master the uncertainty of their approval. He filled his hours with constant internal classification, dissecting the anatomy of a merchant's passing glance until his own mind became an impenetrable crust of interpretations. Yet the harder he calculated the intent of the valley, the heavier and more numb the top of his head became, leaving his thoughts as burdened as a loaded cart on a muddy slope. The master of the herb-drying attic was Elder Ryokan, an old healer whose fingers were permanently stained with the green juices of mountain leaves, and whose slow, deliberate movements held the complete, unhurried stability of the alpine timber. Ryokan did not offer elaborate psychological theories or deliver technical lectures to the boys who worked the drying racks, choosing instead to spend his twilights sorting withered stems by hand or cleaning the small bronze pans of the scales with a piece of rough hemp cloth. He had been quietly tracking the progressive hardening of Shinji's posture, observing how the young apprentice carried his head with a stiff, defensive leverage, and how his breathing stayed confined to the thinned channels of his upper chest whenever he returned from the town paths below. On an evening when the mountain gale began to rattle the exterior cedar shingles, leaving the interior attic wrapped in a seamless, silent sea of dim amber air, Ryokan invited the young man to sit near the central sorting table. The space was profoundly still, save for the dry, regular rustle of the hanging mugwort stalks swinging slightly in the draft and the cold texture of the unpolished floorboards. On the center of the dark hornbeam trestle lay an unpolished bronze counterweight with an off-center suspension loop, an ordinary piece of measurement gear that had grown dark and pitted from decades of contact with the mountain humidity. Shinji stood near the table, his crown tense, his neck locked in a defensive stance, his mind instantly racing to analyze why the weight had been placed before him, preparing to offer a detailed, dynamic explanation on how the balance of the pharmacy scales could be calculated more efficiently. The old herbalist did not pick up a measuring rod, and he did not ask for a technical breakdown of the market prices. Instead, Ryokan reached out his calloused hand, slid the unpolished bronze counterweight across the wood grain so it rested directly between the apprentice's hands, and asked the scholar to notice if the weight was failing to balance the beam because the bronze was deficient, or if the suspension loop itself had simply been forged off-center from the very beginning. Shinji bent closer to the bronze object, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden deep wave of emotional recognition. As he looked at the off-center loop under the dim light of the oil wick, the counterweight had not been damaged by a recent impact, rather, because the small ring at the top had been cast slightly to one side during its creation in the foundry. Every attempt to hang it from the balance beam caused the scale to lean stubbornly to the left, regardless of how pure or empty the matching bronze pans were. He looked up at the old master, his crown throbbing with a dull, leaden pressure as the image of the warped measurement tool mirrored the exact state of his own internal life. He confessed, his voice dropping its defensive precision and trembling against the weight of the realization that his own mind felt exactly like this off-center, weighed a rigid, thinned space where he had been using his fear to measure the thoughts of others, believing that his hypervigilance was a true reflection of reality, when in truth, the instrument he was using to calculate his worth was fundamentally warped by his own dread of being rejected. Ryokan took the heavy bronze piece from the apprentice's hands, carried it over to a small wooden peg on the wall, and without using any force, he simply hung it up in the shadows, letting the object rest completely independent of the balance beam. He looked at the young man and told him that the error of the mind is not its capacity to observe the valley, but the delusion that an analytical measurement can protect the heart from the natural vulnerability of living among people. Ryokan pointed out that other people's moods were merely changing configurations of form. In a wider world, the suffering arrived when the observer refused to drop the scale, trying to secure a permanent sanctuary by turning every casual word into a heavy weight that had to be balanced against the soul. Shinji stood perfectly still in the quiet attic, the dry aroma of the mugwort and the clean, bitter scent of the chicory moving deep into his senses as the top of his skull slowly began to drop its defensive brace. He looked down at the empty hornbeam table, making one small, profound shift in his relationship with his own hypervigilance. He paused, took a single, unhurried breath before his mind could construct another diagnosis, and simply sat with the unclassified reality of the dark room. He stopped the habit of treating his analytical calculations as the absolute truth of his standing, uncurling his forehead and allowing his upper neck to yield its stiffness without needing to solve the intentions of the town merchants tonight. The market was loud, the people were unpredictable, and his standing was entirely unmapped. But he finally stopped using his own crown as a fortress to exclude the vulnerability of the present moment. This was the subtle transformation, a quiet realization that the traveler remains whole and safe, whether the valley offers approval or silence, standing secure within a wide, unmeasured presence that no conceptual scale can ever accurately weigh. As the night wind rolled closer to the slatted walls of the shed, the heavy dullness along his forehead began to lose its edge, letting his awareness return to the simple, stable reality of the ground beneath his frame. He recognized that his true nature was not the perfect calculation he had been striving so fiercely to maintain, but the enduring space of the attic itself, which held the herbs, the weights, and the storm without ever being broken by the weight of the pan. This reflection on the unpolished bronze counterweight and the silent sorting table is not telling us to discard our natural sensitivity to the people around us, nor is it asking us to become cold, indifferent entities who do not care about building meaningful bonds or maintaining the harmony of our social circles. It is not an invitation to force ourselves into an artificial state of complete detachment, where we pretend that a sharp comment or an unexplained shift in a friend's demeanor does not leave a genuine, heavy pressure directly across our skull bones and the fine muscles behind our ears. Instead, it is showing us something much quieter, a gentle shift in our internal orientation that allows us to walk through the world without transforming our minds into a perpetual laboratory of suspicion. The persistent, leaden dullness that locks the top of your head tonight does not exist simply because you live among unpredictable human beings. The deepest suffering takes root when the intellect insists on treating every casual interaction as a problem that must be calculated and resolved before you are permitted to feel safe in your own skin. When we look at this habit of constant social scanning through the simple, direct lens of Buddhist insight, we see that what we often call attachment is actually that stubborn, defensive clenching in the neck that declares, "Until I have perfectly calculated the exact opinion every peer holds of me, my system is forbidden to drop its guard." It is the exhausting habit of using absolute psychological diagnosis as a shield against uncertainty, desperately trying to analyze the hidden motives of those around you, just to outrun the raw vulnerability of being misunderstood. We treat our intellect as if it were a delicate pharmacy scale that must constantly weigh every tiny grain of human feedback. And when the day leaves us flat, we believe our capacity for real connection has been permanently parched. This is the modern reality of craving. It is the frantic, late-night looping that keeps us mentally adjusting the weights of our social standing, hoping that one more perfect explanation will finally grant us the right to rest. But a bronze counterweight cast with an off-center suspension loop cannot register a true balance. No matter how many times you replay the conversations of the afternoon in your thoughts, the trading at the market has already ended. The mineral sacks have been tied up in the dark. The valley has settled into the indigo shadows. When we lie awake burning our remaining vital energy to maintain these heavy mental calculations, we are participating in a quiet internal process that adds a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw, neutral impact of being a social creature in a complex world, the natural fatigue of navigating an ambiguous glance, a delayed reply, or an unreturned gesture. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of our daily reality. The second wound, however, is the one we strike against our own crown when our thoughts turn inward and declare, "Because you feel anxious and constantly look for threat, you are fundamentally deficient, unlovable, and broken." Let this quiet realization sit directly next to the heavy dullness resting on your head right now. Consider what happens when we replace that desperate desire for social certainty with simple, spacious awareness. This quality of mind is not a complex academic discipline that you must master before your eyebrows are permitted to soften. It is simply the capacity to look directly at the parched landscape of your inner worries, without allowing that dryness to dictate the depth of your current breath. It is the ability to observe the rigid restriction behind your ears, to label it gently as the old habit of treating life as an adversarial ledger, and to recognize that the tilt belongs entirely to the warped instrument, not to the wide, unlined presence that is holding you tonight. When you allow the weight to rest on its wall peg without continuously testing it against your value, you stop feeding the analytical frost that keeps your system raw. You let the day exist in the past while you remain open in the present room. Impermanence, translated into the immediate texture of your evening rest, becomes an immense sanctuary for an overworked mind. It acts as a gentle reminder that the monumental weight of other people's assumed judgments is not a solid, eternal block trapped inside your soul. That grand collection of labels and diagnoses was a temporary configuration of thoughts that belonged to a specific hour. It has no physical power to reach into the dark and diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is watching it tonight. The body lying in this bed is entirely separate from those analytical calculations, its skull capable of dropping into a clean, ancient rhythm that has never been restricted by the boundaries of an explanation. You do not have to force your current muscles to maintain a defensive freeze just to protect an intellectual fortress that has already returned to the silence of the herb attic. True letting go does not mean you stop valuing the people in your life, or that you pretend your hypervigilance does not feel heavy. It means you stop using the accuracy of your social calculations as a metric to determine whether you are permitted to take a full, unhurried breath in the dark. It means you acknowledge the caked, thinned channels of your past effort to please. Look at the dry crust with a soft, non-judgmental eye, and then allow the scale to rest where it wills without demanding that your mind become perfectly certain before you are allowed to sleep. When you drop the expectation that your existence must always hold an intact display of absolute understanding for the world to see, you discover that true compassion is the willingness to stand in your own empty center and hold your vulnerable frame with a tenderness that requires no external validation. Right now, notice how effortlessly your body is managing its own survival in the dark, completely unconcerned with the complex formulas you tried to analyze during the daylight hours. Your pulse does not check the layout of your social standing before it agrees to warm your feet, and your lungs do not demand a perfect definition of safety from the valley before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by a deep, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of conceptual performance, resting securely within a night that requires no completed insights before it offers you its rest. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the linen beneath your neck as we prepare to step onto the dry ridge path, where the old nun is waiting to show us the nature of the space that remains when the notched scale beam is finally set aside. If it feels right, let your attention gather very gently right along the broad, flat crown of your head, arriving at the exact physical parameters where that heavy, localized dullness has been anchoring its energy. There is no need to actively push the memory of the market interactions away, and there is no requirement to make your mind completely quiet by force. Simply notice the physical texture of the restriction, observing the stubborn, leaden cap behind your forehead and ears as if you were merely looking at an unpolished bronze counterweight resting on a dark hornbeam table. without any urgency to polish the surface or force the balance beam to instantly balance its pans. As you rest here in the deep indigo-shadowed stillness of the late evening hour, perhaps you can invite a slow wave of softening to move through the deep muscles of your scalp, your skull bones, and the lowest tendons of your neck. Let the small, rigid fibers surrounding your upper ears drop their protective brace, allowing the jaw to drop slightly open naturally, and let your lower abdomen feel wide, as if it were dissolving into the dry, cedar-lined attic beneath your frame. There is no pressure to achieve a sudden state of profound emotional healing in this moment. And even just noticing that your internal muscles still feel tight, guarded, or full of dry friction is entirely enough. You are simply taking stock of your own internal landscape, acknowledging where the mind has been buckle-strapping its armor against the vast uncertainty of an unfortified space. Right now, let the specific memory of that overanalyzed conversation float up into your awareness. Perhaps the exact moment where you felt someone's tone shift, the exhaustion of watching your protective explanations multiply without an answer, or the general heavy worry that you will be permanently cut off from safety if anyone sees the unshielded space in your history. Do not try to analyze the validity of the past reaction, and do not try to fix the social record of the day that has gone. Instead, just name the emotional pattern that is currently tightening across your crown. You might say to yourself, very quietly, "This is the habit of parsing the empty pan," or "This is the old analytical frost trying to freeze the open beam." Just by naming it, you are stepping out of the dark, urgent internal laboratory and standing beside Elder Ryokan on the cedar floorboards, looking at the caked weight from a place of unhurried safety. Imagine that your remaining social worries are like that heavy, unpolished bronze weight, its natural capacity having become hardened and unyielding from hours of continuous, dry hyper-vigilance. Look at its off-center shape in your mind's eye. See how many times your thoughts have gripped that rough ring today, fixing your sight entirely upon the spent definition, letting that cold restriction convince you that your true nature has been permanently parched. In this quiet space, if it feels comfortable, imagine taking that heavy, burning need to secure a conceptual certainty, that persistent wish to hide your natural vulnerability beneath a mountain of approval, and allowing it to rest quietly inside the hollow, off-center loop of the weight. You do not have to build a fortress across the valley with your exhaustion, and you do not have to decipher the infinite mystery. You are simply setting the implement down on the wall peg, while you step back into your own breathing body. Watch what happens to the internal space across your lower neck as you let the responsibility sit outside of your identity. Perhaps the image of the caked, dry bronze begins to change its texture under the steady, cool sweep of the winter evening. Imagine the thick, sun-baked crust of oxidation beginning to soften naturally, its dark layers expanding, splitting, and flaking away from the underlying metal under the gentle pressure of the damp air, leaving the unlined stone curb of your awareness completely clear and open beneath the surface. The faint, bitter aroma of dried chicory rises from the storage bins, filling the room with a stable, grounded quality that has nothing to do with the forced execution of logic. The mountain does not collapse, and the floorboards remain completely solid beneath your weight, holding their space with absolute security. The dust on the table does not diminish the capacity of the stone to remain steady. It is simply a layer of sand in the room, entirely separate from the deep, unmeasured field that is holding you tonight. If your thoughts begin to drift back toward the market agreements, the expectations of the village elders, or the structures you wish you could fortify to prove your absolute worth, you can return to the simple, rhythmic expansion of your lower lungs whenever you are ready. There is no failure in a mind that wanders back to its protective spaces. The slow hiss of the candle wick outside the window pane does not apologize for moving in the dark, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in your vast, open hall of awareness, and they cannot permanently break your true self, unless you choose to believe that you are the off-center, bronze counterweight. Nothing needs to be forced tonight, dear friend. You are not required to empty your heart of its frost through an act of sheer will. and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning light arrives. You are simply a living form, letting the heavy, unalterable rolls of the Weighmaster rest on the hook, while the unmoving dark continues to cradle your center, leaving your inner vault wide, unanchored, and deeply at peace. Further up the rocky paths where the thin alpine air bit sharply against the skin, an isolated mountain pharmacy hut sat exposed to the silent, sub-zero drafts of the highest ridge. The atmosphere within this small rock-walled sanctuary remained thick with the smell of crushed juniper needles, bitter gentian root, and the dry, ancient wood of old storage chests. In this solitary workspace lived Jen, an advanced scholar whose skull carried an unyielding, leaden tightness that locked the base of his neck into a rigid, permanent anchor. Years earlier, Jen had been tasked with compounding the primary medicinal extracts for the entire Valley network, driven by an intense internal anxiety that an incorrect measurement or an unpredicted variation in the herbs would cause subtle harm and ruin his standing among the master monks. He had become utterly obsessed with absolute precision. He spent his nights sitting over his balance scale, meticulously recarving the tiny gradation notches on his hornbeam scale beam using a small iron file. He operated under the stubborn illusion that his worth was measured by his ability to map out every microscopic variation, trying to recarve the wood grain to account for the changing humidity of the seasons and the unpredictable temperaments of the sick monks who received the tonics. He believed that if he could only anticipate every potential error through continuous mental calculation, he would achieve an unassailable security. He ignored the progressive, localized heavy cap that settled directly on the top of his head from years of squinting at the scale, treating his hypervigilance as the only valid response to a chaotic world. Yet the more aggressively he tried to notch the beam to fit his anxious models, the more brittle the wood became, until the delicate markings ran together in an illegible blur, leaving him completely unable to trust his own eyes, while the weight across his crown grew as heavy as a river boulder. The elder guide of the highest ridge pharmacy was Sister Shaku, an old nun whose forearms were lean and weathered from decades of carrying mountain water, and whose slow, deliberate presence held the absolute neutral weight of the granite cliffs outside. Shaku did not offer abstract psychological definitions or deliver formal academic lectures to the students who struggled on the paths, choosing instead to spend her hours discarding ruined tinctures or wiping the storage jars with a damp wool cloth. She had been quietly tracking the progressive freezing of Jen's posture, noting how his shoulders remained hunched toward his ears, even when the evening wind had died, and how his responses to the simple requests of the pharmacy had grown sharp, brittle, and defensive. On an evening when the mountain frost turned the surrounding stone paths into a gray, impenetrable vault, Shaku called the young scholar to the central preparation counter. The room was profoundly cold, save for the faint, steady hiss of an oil wick burning down in a stone bowl and the crisp scent of the high altitude moving through the cedar door frames. On the center of the table lay a carved hornbeam scale beam with unevenly notched gradation lines, its delicate timber worn raw by the constant, aggressive scraping of Jen's file. Jen stood by the counter, his skull throbbing with an unyielding pressure, his mind instantly racing to justify why he needed to recarve the beam yet again, his intellect working to construct an elaborate defense before the old nun could point out the ruined markings. The old woman did not criticize his technique, and she did not order him to stop his work. Instead, Shaku reached into her sleeve, pulled out a plain, smooth piece of seasoned hornbeam that had never been touched by a file, a completely unnotched scale beam, without a single line or marker carved into its surface, and placed it gently into his stiff, white-knuckled fingers. She looked at him and asked him to consider if the master who first shaped the scales relied on the complexity of the notches to find the balance, or if the wood itself already knew how to sit level before the markings were forced into the grain. Jen gripped the smooth timber piece, the raw, unlined wood cooling the heat of his palms, his breath catching in his chest with a sudden wave of heavy emotional recognition. The scale beam had not been broken by an external accident, rather, because he had been continuously filing the wood to match his own anxious calculations. He had stripped the implement of its natural substance, turning a reliable tool into a thin, unstable sliver that warped under the simple weight of the air. He looked at the old nun, his crown vibrating with an intense, unspent sorrow as the image of the ruined timber mirrored the exact state of his own internal life. He realized that his own mind felt exactly like that overfiled beam, a rigid, thin space where he had been continuously cutting into his own peace out of fear, believing that his hyper-vigilance was keeping the valley safe, when in truth, his frantic calculations were only destroying the very vessel that held his life. The old nun did not offer an immediate formula to fix the medicines, and she did not promise that the future would be free from error. Instead, she placed her hand lightly over his forearm, and with a quiet, unhurried pressure, guided him to make one small, profound shift in his relationship with reality, not to achieve a state of perfect wisdom, but to simply sit at the cedar counter in the dark with the unnotched beam, choosing to stop the habit of treating every anxious calculation as the absolute truth. Jin stood perfectly still on the stone floor, his shoulders slowly dropping an inch away from his ears as he lowered the iron file to the table, letting it rest on the slate with a low, metallic click that signaled the end of his resistance. He did not become a magically perfect master in that single moment, and his head did not instantly lose its localized dullness, but he made one vital choice. He paused, took a single deep breath before his mind could construct another diagnosis of failure, and chose to sit quietly with the uncertainty of the unmeasured herbs. He stopped the desperate struggle to carve the future into his own skull, allowing the plain, unnotched timber to remain smooth and open in his lap without needing to verify his value to the world tonight. The valley was silent, the path ahead was unmapped, and the weights were entirely uncounted. But he finally stopped using his own intellect as a weapon to exclude the simple presence of the night. This was the subtle transformation, a quiet, grounding realization that the self remains whole and safe whether the mind possesses a perfect calculation or sits in total obscurity, resting securely within a wide, unmeasured presence that requires no external tallies to stay complete. As the midnight air rolled through the slatted walls of the pharmacy, the heavy leaden cap along his crown began to lose its rigid edge, letting his awareness return to the simple, stable reality of the bed beneath his frame. He recognized that his true nature was not the perfect definition he had been striving so fiercely to preserve, but the enduring movement of the breath itself, which could receive the mountain air without ever needing to notch the skin to prove its depth. When we turn our awareness inward to examine the heavy, localized dullness currently holding the skull bones and the fine muscles behind your ears, we begin to map the intricate emotional mechanism that converts the raw vulnerability of human interaction into a permanent state of internal isolation. We often believe that this feeling of being socially exhausted or emotionally parched is an external accident, a simple consequence of living among unpredictable people, or being trapped in a demanding routine. But if you look closely at the deep, unyielding tension across your forehead tonight, you will see that this leaden cap is actually an active, ongoing construction of the intellect. It is the somatic consequence of using absolute control as a defensive shield, an exhausting energetic effort to resist the fluid, changing movements of reality by parsing every word and gesture as if your life depended on a perfect diagnosis. We treat our minds as a constant wood-carving bench, continuously scraping, filing, and altering the grain of our presence under the tragic delusion that if we can maintain an unblemished boundary of approval, we will finally be safe from the risk of being unseen. This habitual reliance on intellectual hypervigilance is a deeply rooted form of resistance against the natural uncertainty of existence. When an unexpected social shift occurs, perhaps a sudden drop in a close alignment, the realization that your current role no longer reflects your internal growth, or the quiet dread of facing an empty space without a title, the mind experiences a profound sense of threat. Instead of allowing the raw texture of that vulnerability to be felt, the intellect immediately steps forward to take command, working at an immense frantic velocity to categorize and calculate the space. We rehearse the future, we replay the past, and we map out endless defense strategies, operating under the assumption that keeping our life perfectly measured is the only true way to prevent rejection. But this constant scanning acts exactly like the sharp iron file driven repeatedly into the notched hornbeam, scale beam. It strips the implement of its natural substance, turning a reliable tool into a thin, unstable sliver that warps under the simple weight of the air, leaving the crown locked in a heavy grip, while the living clarity of your original nature turns dull beneath the surface. This is the exact point where we can begin to separate the original weight of existence from the elaborate psychological structures the mind builds on top of it. Simple Buddhist wisdom approaches this dilemma by making a direct, compassionate distinction between the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral impact of being a sensitive creature in a world constructed out of changing forms, temporary alignments, and natural human boundaries. It is the sudden arrival of an ambiguous glance. It is the raw sensation of realizing you have outgrown a space that once nurtured you. It is the simple, unavoidable sorrow that occurs when a career or personal path runs out of generative space. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, yes, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of a dynamic life. We cannot control the arrival of the first pain, for the thin alpine air on the highest ridge does not ask the permission of the scholar before it passes through the stone walls of the pharmacy hut. The true torment begins when our thoughts take that first pain and knead it into a permanent moral identity, actively constructing the second pain out of our own resistance. The second pain is the elaborate mental trial we host right along our forehead and neck joints, where we translate a temporary state of social fatigue into a definitive commentary on our absolute value. We do not simply notice that we are feeling tired or disconnected. The mind turns inward and whispers, "Because you feel anxious in this environment, you are fundamentally deficient, unlovable, and permanently banned from true liberation." We do not just navigate an intense period of professional transition. Our thoughts declare, "This unmapped path is proof that your core is inherently broken and incapable of finding a balance." This is the mechanism of turning a temporary pocket of stagnation into a solid identity. The unfortunate habit of mistaking a natural piece of hornbeam timber for an eternal monument that must be forced into shape through even harder mental scrutiny. When we exist within this pattern of self-judgment, our awareness spends its late night hours trying to fix the self through a subtle application of shame, using our self-criticism as a temporary payment to satisfy the internal investigator we carry in our skin. We believe that keeping the inner dialogue sharp, analytical, and critical is a form of protection, that if we keep the file moving against the wood, we will somehow force ourselves to remain safely unassailable tomorrow. We develop an insatiable need for conceptual approval, trying to decipher the hidden motives of friends and family to prevent the sudden sting of conflict. But trying to heal your exhausted spirit through the accumulation of mental categories is like trying to preserve a balance scale by cutting the notches deeper into the beam. The markings remain trapped in a blurry line, waiting to restrict your natural breathing the moment the amber light fades. True inner transformation does not manifest because you have finally forced every single relationship of your life to become perfectly predictable through an act of sheer will. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the willingness to stand by the cedar counter without immediately picking up the iron file to strike your own crown. When you allow the reality of the unmeasured hour to exist without transforming it into an absolute verdict on your soul, you are stopping the second pain before it can plant its roots in your body. You are choosing to sit quietly among the crushed juniper needles in the dark, letting the plain timber beam remain unnotched in your lap, and letting the inner room be vast, without needing to apologize to the universe for the lack of perfect clarity running through your foundation. As you let the bed support the heavy framework of your spine right now, notice how the desperate urge to possess a perfect explanation begins to lose its grip when it is met with simple, non-judgmental presence. You do not have to settle the record of your entire social standing or personal history before the night ends, and you do not need to guarantee that your path will be fully balanced by tomorrow morning. The path toward inner freedom does not ask you to become a magically perfect machine that never experiences the sting of doubt or isolation. It simply requires the very small, very steady discipline of noticing the heavy dullness along your forehead, naming it as the old defensive pretense, and refusing to give its declarations the authority of truth. You are the vast, silent attic that holds both the raw counterweight and the quiet grease lamp. You are not the off-center loop that is currently resting in the dark. In a moment, this gentle insight will move even closer to the small, ordinary triggers of your modern life, showing us how to carry this soft hand into the waking world without guilt. But for now, let your attention sink down into the quiet, unmoving center of your upper frame. Let your skull bones and your neck muscles expand outward on their own natural rhythm, taking up all the space they require in the indigo shadows, completely free from the narrow metrics of conceptual performance. You are safe enough to drop the protective armor right here, leaving your spirit as unmapped, smooth, and supportive as the unnotched wood before the first line of calculation was ever forced into its surface. Now let this quiet understanding step softly across the centuries, moving out of the silent mountain repository and directly into the small electric friction of your ordinary evening. The unpolished bronze counterweight and the smooth, unnotched scale beam we have been exploring are not abstract concepts designed to live only within an old wilderness archive. They are the exact configurations of energy you hold down in your skull bones and your deep neck joints when you lie awake at midnight, staring at the blank screen of your phone, waiting for a text message or an analytical answer that might validate your choices or offer a temporary reassurance that you have not permanently failed the metric of human alignment. We live so much of our modern lives inside this structural hyper-vigilance, repeatedly checking our devices for an external confirmation of our safety, replaying a minor professional mistake or an unclassified interaction, as if the sheer force of our anxiety could somehow rewrite the reality of our day. We perform the role of the unshakable guide during the daylight hours, smiling warmly while feeling an immense heavy thickness inside our chest, carrying the constant worry that we are fundamentally falling behind our peers, or that our true, unadorned self is simply not enough to sustain our place in the valley. You can begin to transform this exhausting mechanism right in the middle of the very moments that cause your breathing to shallow, recognizing that peace is not an allure-nothing victory, but a quality practiced in the smallest, most unexceptional slivers of the day. When you find yourself caught in the frantic urge to control a relationship, check your notifications for reassurance, or fear the absolute uncertainty of the future, you are fully permitted to pause. A single, slow breath taken before you offer an answer or look at your screen is a profound form of wisdom. It is a quiet, somatic realization that not every self-critical thought deserves your immediate obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command that must be followed into a Latinite internal courtroom. You can care deeply about the people in your life, without gripping the heavy balance scale so tightly that you tear the skin of your own spirit. You are simply stepping out into the wide room of your own presence, letting the dusty residue of your daily interactions pass over your mind without allowing it to compromise the permanent, load-bearing foundation of your true stone frame. Perhaps you have spent years operating under the hidden law that your right to rest must be bought with a continuous display of flawless execution, and that wanting to let your eyes close while your inner schedule remains unresolved is a form of guilt-ridden failure. We treat our rest as a luxury that must be earned through absolute competence, fearing that if we stop carrying the weight of the logs or analyzing our vulnerability, we will be left completely exposed in the dark. But the seasoned cedar does not feel a shred of remorse for holding only an unladen chassis, and the raw granite stones do not apologize to the ridge for letting their basin remain empty under the fog. You can rest without earning it first. Your exhaustion is not a moral debt that must be settled through hours of overthinking. It is simply the natural voice of an internal posture that has run out of vital energy from trying to push an overweighted cart through sheer force of will. It is entirely possible to navigate your modern daily realities, the unuttered arguments, the missed markers, and the uneven paths without allowing the lack of external validation to crush your own pelvic bowl. When we attempt to control the past or hide our natural fatigue through the continuous application of our own shame, we are acting like Jen before his hands were uncurled, refusing to let the reality of the warping joist exist as a natural configuration of a vast, shifting world. True inner freedom begins when you allow your living biography to be offered to the universe with a loose, receptive hand. You can maintain your daily responsibilities, contemplate your growth, or rest your body with the simple, unforced presence of raw timber, letting the surface pattern exist without demanding that it match a standard of absolute perfection. The next time the creeping burning of exhaustion settles deep into your lower spine, when you find yourself comparing your hidden, tired routine to the manufactured triumphs of those around you, look down at the quiet weight of your own posture and take a slow breath. The goal you missed or the checklist you could not deliver is merely the external weather of a long, unpredictable human existence. You do not have to pretend the internal void did not feel heavy, and you do not have to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the raw edge of your exhaustion has even cooled. It is completely enough to sit with the uncertainty of your own unfinished healing, letting the irregular fragments of your day rest on the counter without needing to stamp them with the label of permanent ruin. In a few moments, the remaining definitions and standards of the daylight hours will dissolve entirely into the dark, leaving nothing but the vast, protective space of this midnight room. As your limbs prepare to surrender their final defensive postures, release the illusion that you must secure every single boundary of your public identity before you are permitted to let your wrists relax. The expectations of the day carry no authority in this quiet sanctuary, and the unresolved demands can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your window. Let your attention drop back down into the steady, unhandled rise and fall of your lower lungs, knowing that the load-bearing substance of your true nature is already fully intact, completely wide, and entirely at peace. The dark hour has fully arrived now, and the quiet gravity of the night is settling over your bed like the thick, unmoving frost that holds the upper ridge terraces in absolute stillness. Every single effort you made today, every tireless measurement you tried to build beneath your skull bones, and every anxious reach for approval has dropped its momentum, dissolving into the silence of this indigo-shadowed room. The heavy, unalterable expectations of the distant market valley are no longer pulling at your neck joints. They have slid away, falling through the floorboards into the damp earth, leaving your internal pharmacy completely empty, spacious, and calm. Your head and your deep shoulder blades are sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the surface beneath you, as if the unlined timber of your true nature were finally remembering its relationship with the steady, load-bearing foundation of the mountain bedrock. Let your breathing become very small, very quiet, and entirely effortless. There is absolutely no need to regulate the air as it moves down through your chest cage. The body knows how to expand and soften on its own time, like the slow, steady movement of the winter wind passing directly through the slatted cedar walls of the attic repository. With every long, unheard release of breath, the distinct, localized restriction that you held across your forehead is letting go of its grip. The discordant lines of your uncompleted social calculations are no longer being tracked or verified by an internal investigator. The unpolished bronze counterweights have been hung on their shadow pegs. The smooth hornbeam beams are resting on the sorting table, and the critical analytical voices have completely vanished beneath a blanket of silent, protective dark. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight. The variable balances, the carved gradation notches, and the safety formulas for tomorrow do not require your active parsing while the high trails are cold. They can remain suspended in the shadows outside your window pane, completely separate from the living form that is resting here in the quiet. You are under no obligation to repair your entire personal history before your eyes are allowed to close. You are permitted to be unwritten, unmeasured, and completely finished with the labor, resting within the safe sanctuary of an uncompromised night that asks for no conceptual performance before it offers you its blanket of rest. The teaching of the smooth, unmarked timber is settling deep into the marrow of your bones now, filling the heavy spaces across your forehead with an all-enveloping tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence that was always waiting beneath your desire to secure the perfect diagnosis, the vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot be weighed because it belongs to the raw, uncarved landscape of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours, while your spirit drifts further away from the language of endless tracking and psychological metrics. Your upper frame is loose. Your core is heavy like a dark bundle of dried roots resting in the frost, and the still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. What if the true sanctuary of the mind lives not in the deep markings carved to gauge the world, but in the absolute blank simplicity of the thick winter ice that rests smooth and unnotched over the silent mountain pool? The thick sheet of winter ice does not count the flakes that gather upon its surface, nor does it attempt to calculate the depth of the dark water flowing silently beneath its crust. It simply remains a vast and unnotched plain of cool clarity, utterly indifferent to the need for measurement, categorization, or defense. All the residual, heavy static that accumulated at the crown of your skull during the long hours of scanning faces, parsing intonations, and anticipating hidden judgments is losing its texture, dissolving into the wide, cold simplicity of this midnight hour. The internal scale maker that keeps your upper spine taut is running out of material to weigh, because there is no ledger left to balance, no social failure to correct, and no unwritten law that declares your silence a flaw. You are simply here, a physical form breathing in the shadow, entirely separate from the public roles, tracking systems, and analytical frameworks you performed during the daylight hours. When we observe this heavy mental ceiling through a quiet and unhurried awareness, we discover that true sanctuary is not a reward earned by successfully parsing every nuance of human psychology. It is the radical, simple freedom of changing your relationship with the uncertainty itself, allowing the internal pan to sit completely empty for a season, without transforming that quiet space into a personal indictment. The intellect creates the second wound, when it takes the raw, neutral fatigue of social exposure and wraps it in a narrative of systemic failure, whispering that you must continuously adjust your defenses to prove that your presence is valid. But the mountain pharmacy does not count the grains of sand that rest on the floorboards, and the heavy granite walls do not check the valley tallies before they agree to hold their place through the cold gale. You are allowed to be unclassified. You are allowed to let the analytical file come to a complete halt without believing that the inner bedrock has been ruined. Think of how much vital energy has been spent in the latter night hours trying to optimize your presentation, replaying the moments where your pacing fell behind, or trying to guarantee that your social security will be perfectly unyielding when the sun rises. That continuous mental architecture, that defensive looping that treats every unparsed conversation as a personal emergency that must be corrected through harder self-scrutiny before you are permitted to close your eyes, is the very weight that leaves your crown and eyebrows feeling so thinned and rigid. But tonight, the high trails are quiet and the dried root bundles are still. The interpretation you missed or the validation you could not secure is merely a temporary configuration in a long, complex life of human movement, entirely unable to alter the profound, load-bearing awareness that is cradling your upper frame right now. You do not have to finish your psychological calculations to be worthy of this hour, and you do not need to feel completely understood before you let your skull bones yield to the dark. Let your focus drop even deeper now, leaving the narrative of your modern obligations behind and settling fully into the heavy, immovable center of your body. Feel the quiet, supportive mass of your frame as it gives its entire weight to the stillness beneath you, perfectly held by an ancient, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of conceptual execution. The smooth, hornbeam timbers have held their level through countless winter storms, without needing to generate a single notch of progress to prove their utility. And your system is fully capable of resting in that exact same unlit security tonight. Every digital update, every analyzed text message, and every expectation of absolute performance can remain suspended in the cool evening mist outside, completely powerless to reach into this dark sanctuary. The movement of your breath is becoming so slow, so thin, and so unforced that it feels like nothing more than the faint, rhythmic whistle of dry, mountain air passing through the high eaves when the gale has entirely passed into the valley. There is no longer any separation between the immense, dark space of the ridge and the stillness that is expanding within the framework of your head. The social ledgers that were spinning through your mind a few hours ago have turned into pale, translucent vapor, dissolving into the wide, unconditioned landscape of your presence without leaving a single fracture behind. You are returning to the native, untroubled sanctuary that existed long before you ever learned to measure your internal harmony. By the speed of your intellect, the silent, unpolished room where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let the final gradations and definitions of the day fall away into the floorboards, leaving your spirit as unmapped, smooth and silent as the unnotched wood sitting in the deep shade. There are no expectations to satisfy, no interaction tallies to maintain, and no versions of your capacity to defend in this beautiful protective dark. The world will manage its own weights without your active pull for the next few hours, and the morning will bring its own sky when the light is ready. But right now, in this single pocket of pure presence, nothing is required of your crown but the simple willingness to let the crust split and rest. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy, rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep.